The great thing about law is it's democratic. Everybody can participate. But if I can't see it, I cannot participate.
There's a body of administrative law that happens behind closed doors in government offices, and we don't think it's sound policy that those administrative determinations are held close to the vest. We think that they should be known to everyone.
For law to be just, it has to be open.
Secret law is an abomination. Operating in the sunshine, I think, is better than operating in the darkness. When the Freedom of Information Act was passed, I began to reflect that it was really strange that we had this very large body of private law which was not open to the public and which seemed to me to be very much eligible for opening to the public under the FOIA. And so years later, when we were backed into this corner by a denial of our right to sue in the public interest under the zone of interest test, the only kinds of suits that we were able to bring were Freedom of Information actions. And so one of the very first suits that we began to consider was a suit to open IRS rulings to public scrutiny. And that's how we got into the Freedom of Information area.
For the first year, things are rough. He basically doesn't have any money.
Fortunately, my wife offered to keep me alive, to feed me for 2 years while I got the organization started.
It was not such a big sacrifice. I mean, it would have been nice to have additional income, but I thought the idea was excellent.
Tom lends the organization $60 to pay for postage and envelopes and something like that, and that is the sum total of the organization's income for its first year. But then they get a grant.
Which was $60,000, and that was enough to keep us going for about 2 years.
And this allows him to hire some staff to open an office in downtown Washington.
One of our goals was to assist the press in understanding tax issues.
Tax Analysts is not just a news service. We tell our readers what's important, we tell our readers why it's important to them, and we tell them how it's going to affect them.
When Tom figured out that the country's major newspapers were not going to be assertive about publishing the things that he found out through FOIA, he thought, well, I'll do it myself.
We decided to begin publishing a sheaf of papers every week, which we would mail to the press free. So we hired Jim Byrne. He became the first editor of Tax Notes.
We do legal and policy analysis. Now, there were readers who were a little shocked by this, and we got letters, how dare you, criticize our transactions. But over the years, they started to appreciate it and demand more of it.
Before too long, the grant funding starts to run out. And Tom, meanwhile, has been publishing this thing, but people really like it. And so as a way to pay the bills, or to begin to pay the bills, Tom decides he's going to have to turn this into a subscription product.
And I remember calling our staff together. I said to them, we have this little publication which we're giving away free, and I think we could charge money for it.
Without that initial effort to turn Tax Notes into a subscription product, the organization probably wouldn't have survived. And it proved to be remarkably successful.
This newsletter eventually became central to our business model. The world would be very different if one of the editors at the New York Times had said, "Oh yeah, sure, we'll publish it." Then he wouldn't have needed tax notes, and I think the tax world would be very different.
He got word the amount of the paper's deduction had been about $440,000. So Ira figured that given the paper's deduction, the president's personal residence, and his second residence, Ira could not see how the president had paid much, if any, income taxes.
And tax analysts released a long report suggesting that this deduction was almost impossible to explain as legitimate. And then tax analysts distributed this information to news reporters at major newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, who then made use of it to do their own coverage of it.
It certainly put us on the front pages of a lot of papers across the country. And that, coupled with what's called the rulings disclosure suit, made us well known to the public. Without those two events, I'm not sure we would have survived for 50 years.
We're going retro with that, huh? Keep cranking the camera too, okay? The 70s was just a warming up exercise for the tremendous changes in tax policy that were going to take place in the 80s, starting with the Reagan tax cuts in 1981, and then the reforms in 82 and 84 that nobody heard about, but then the mega reform in 86.
Ronald Reagan turns to his Treasury Department and says, "I'm interested in tax reform." The Treasury Department is filled with people who believe in this kind of tax reform, and Reagan put his full weight behind it. And this was a great thing for tax analysts, because this seemed to us like one of those moments when the tax law was on the brink of reform, and that the people driving that reform were some of the deep thinkers. More than any other piece of tax reform, this got close to the ideals.
Some of us who are young and naive thought, we need to broaden the base and lower the rates. Everybody else thought it was a wonderful idea, so the time had converged in Washington that everybody was going to go rewrite the tax code. But in order to do that, in order to make this omelet, you have to break a lot of eggs.
The tax law didn't necessarily stay close to those ideals for very long after the passage of that law. I mean, immediately they started chipping away at it again, because a lot of people get disillusioned with that version of tax reform. As a result, other kinds of tax reform have started to get debated. Well, we cover that too.
There's never a lull in tax policy. We started noticing things that other people weren't noticing right off the bat, which was a lot of large corporations weren't paying a lot of taxes. So in 1990s, it was the tax shelters.
You understand that tax follows trade, and trade is increasingly globalized. So the tax issues you're going to get a lot of inbound, outbound tax issues. And these were, for multinational corporations, sort of where the big money is.
As we move into the 2000s, it was offshore profit shifting.
So multinationals were doing a lot of profit shifting, and it resulted in them lowering their effective tax rates quite a bit. So you do a story about some company that had millions and millions of dollars in profits and really wasn't paying that much in tax.
Because I am the nerdiest guy on the planet, what I do for fun is I look through annual reports. And so I'd look through all the usual suspects, like the tech companies, which had lots of profits offshore. But for some reason, Apple was always a goody two-shoes, had a high effective tax rate. But one day, I don't know, I must have spilled my coffee on the wrong page, and I noticed that because of an accounting change, which wasn't illegal or bad in any way, but it sort of hid the fact that they had a tremendous amount of money offshore. So I wrote this article. Once it hit the New York Times, every journalist in America was looking under these rocks. And profit shifting by multinational corporations has been front page news for the last 10 years.
So it's exciting for us when a sort of nerdy, geeky, nuanced tax issue percolates to the popular attention of the masses, and you actually hear it on the evening news. Things like that kind of get us very excited.
anytime you talk to him, you could really tell just how passionate he was about tax analysts, about tax policy in general, and about transparency and the mission of the company.
Like Tom Field, Chris Bergen always wanted to push the envelope. Now, Chris was a little more businesslike and organized in how he did it. Tom was always like, let the torpedoes fly and we'll think about it afterwards. Let's put it this way, Chris at least aimed, but we still let the torpedoes fly.
Chris brought a sense of professionalism to the organization, and I think really was one of the many impetuses that took us from being that scrappy nonprofit to being a legitimate company that stands on its own and has its rightful place in the tax community.
I think people know that the place is driven by more than just the bottom line. We have people at Tax Analysts who actually give a damn.
If we're getting as many complaints that we are a left organization, that we are a right organization, then we're getting it right at the end of the day. You know, I've always thought of us as the place where the debate starts.
Informed debate requires information, and to get information, you need better transparency.
Transparency shouldn't be just benefit for U.S. citizens. It should be for everyone living in a democracy. So I think it would be exciting to replicate our FOIA activity overseas.
That act of getting information into the hands of practitioners, into the hands of the public, has really fulfilled the vast majority of our mission over the years.
I think that 50 years from now, people are going to be saying that the tax system is a mess. It needs to be overhauled, and we're going to rip it out by the roots and replace it tomorrow, because I think that's the way people talk about taxes. But that's okay. We are in pursuit of excellence. We do not expect to ever achieve actual excellence.
If there's going to be as much change in the next 25 years as there was in the prior 25 years, I think we're going to have a hell of a ride.